Welcome to Cantini Park. Today we're going to be doing a little safety overview. We call it working safely from ground to crown. We're going to cover some major bullet points on how to work safely, starting from the shop and getting out on the job site. This isn't supposed to be a blueprint for how you do all tree work, just kind of some big reminders of stuff that we think are really important. My name is Beau Nagan. I'm the forestry manager here at Cantini Park. I'm also the Illinois Arborist Association president-elect and Illinois tree climbing champion from last year. This is my associate, Chris Patnaude, aka Patty. He's been working in the industry for 3 years now for us. He does all of my brush dragging and climbing hawthorns. He's not a certified arborist yet, but he will be soon. He's a very good trainer though, and he'll be helping me out today. All right, so before we go out and work in the tree, we want to make sure that all of our climbing gear and our PPE is properly inspected and suited for the type of work we're doing. So in order to know what we're allowed to use for tree work operations, because there's carabiners we use for tree work and there's carabiners we can use for recreational rock climbing and other things that might be okay for one activity but not the other. So whenever you have a question about what you can use, what you can't use, you need to reference the Z 133 2017, which is the most recent version. They usually come out with a new one every 3 years, and if you go through for climbing equipment and rigging equipment and everything tree work related, they'll give you the standard in which it needs to meet and the specifications in which they have to meet. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but I just want to show you guys this so that you know that this is your safety reference manual for all tree work operations and gear, okay? So let's get started by taking a look at our PPE. And by that, I specifically mean our hard hat. When we look at our hard hat, number one, most manufacturers recommend that you retire them every 5 years. The hard hat may look fine, and it may not seem to have any cracks or significant wear, but the fact is, with a lot of our equipment, the number one thing that degrades them is ultraviolet rays. So being out in the sun every day weakens it, which means if you do have an accident, the level of safety which this helmet will provide will be drastically reduced if you take it beyond its expiration date. So if you look inside the hard hat, there's usually a label right here that will both have the ANSI standard on it along with the date of manufacture. Be honest with you, most of the time when I get a hard hat, I'll just write the date in it in which I start using it, and I'll just use the year and the month, and then I'll know when to retire it. So that's usually pretty straightforward. Now, things that I'll do is I'll squeeze the hard hat, and what that'll do, if you squeeze it both ways, you'll be able to see any small cracks open up that you might not be able to see when it's just sitting in the neutral position. I'll also look at the suspension in the hard hat and make sure that all the connections are still in good shape, they're not broken, and nothing has any undue wear or any cracks in it. And that's pretty much so the standard with that. Your hearing protection as well. If you're using muffs like this, you're going to want to inspect the pad on the inside of the ear because they'll wear out over the years, and it'll lose its ability to seal properly to your head and reduce the decibels like they need to. So make sure that you look at those. You don't need to buy a whole new hearing protection set. You can just buy what they call a sanitary kit, which will go ahead and replace the padding on the inside and the ear cup on the outside. So that's our helmets. Let's talk a little bit about Arborist climbing lines, okay? Here's Dragonfly by Teufelberger. This is 11.1 millimeter rope. If you look at the ANSI standard, the strict standard says that an Arborist climbing line must be a 1/2 inch. It must have a minimum breaking strength of 5,400 pounds, and it can't have any more than 7% stretch in the rope as far as elasticity. However, it does have a stipulation that if your employer says it's okay, you may use Arborist lines that are as small as 11 millimeters for work positioning climbing and as small as 10 millimeters for strict rope access and ascent. So keep that in mind. If you want to use a smaller rope, that's fine as long as your employer is okay with it. So let's talk a little bit about ropes. I'm not going to go too deep into different construction types because there are a lot. My recommendation, anytime you're looking to buy a rope, go to a reputable tree gear provider, an arborist supply company. There's a lot of them online, and they usually have good descriptions online, and they give you all of the specs that I just went over on each rope so you know what you're purchasing. So when we look at a rope, we always say that the standard says you have to inspect it before every use. And that sounds a little hard, except for the simple way of doing it is inspect it every time you're done using it. That way the next time you use it, you know it's already all right. So how do I do that? When it's up in the tree and I'm pulling it down into the bag, I'm looking at it as I pull it through my hand, and equally, if not more so important, I'm feeling the rope for diameter changes, bulges, any sort of tears. It's almost easier to feel an imperfection in the rope than it is to see it sometimes. And then once you identify an area like that, then you inspect the rope for damage. If it's if it's majorly deformed as far as a bulge or some sort of real, like it feels very narrowed, you may have to either cut that rope shorter if you want to continue using it, or just retire that rope. But you want to take a close look at it. When it comes to damage to the fibers, you can have up to 25% of the fibers damaged and still use the rope, but that's the high end. That's when you retire at 25. And that doesn't mean a quarter of your rope is cut right here. That means kind of damaged in 25% of the surface area or less. So keep that in mind. If it's all in one area, it's probably weakened enough that you can't use that rope. Another thing that's important is to make sure that if you do have a splice die on the rope, that it's properly labeled, or you save the label so you know it was properly spliced by a reputable splicer or manufacturer that will put the standard directly on the rope as far as what was the cordage it was spliced on, the size. A lot of times it'll have the date on there that it was spliced. And then very specific, this is a slice by Teufelberger, which is kind of a hybrid between a sewn and a hand splice. And it's very specific, it's coded, it's something that has to be done. You don't want somebody to do this with the sewing machine in their mom's basement. It has to be something that's labeled by a reputable splicer, and it has all of the this has EN requirements, sorry, I'll get to that in a minute. It has all the OSHA and CE requirements for splices listed on the label. So this splice is in pretty good shape. I don't see any real big damage on it. I don't really see anything wrong with it. It's fairly new. The rope is fairly new as well. I actually know from inspecting it further down the rope, I have one little pick, one strand that got cut, but that I trimmed down, and it's fine because it's a single strand in the rope. So yet again, that's climbing lines. There's a lot of them. Don't buy a climbing line unless you're sure it is specified for tree climbing specifically. And then on a side note, we have rigging ropes as well, which I'm not going to go into, but what's important to know about them is never use the same ropes for climbing as you do for rigging, because it'll get very confusing, and you never climb on a rope that you use for rigging, because we put a lot heavier loads into rigging. We beat them up really bad, and more importantly, rigging ropes aren't supporting anybody's life, and the climbing ropes are. So let's move on from there. That's climbing lines. Let's talk a little bit about carabiners. There's two basic locking mechanisms that we use for any carabiner, but the basic requirement is that the locking mechanism on any arborist climbing carabiner must have two distinct motions before the gate will open. So this is called a triac style, where you have to push the gate up and then rotate it before it'll open. This is a safe, a good safe locking mechanism for arborist purposes. And then all hardware that we use when we climb must have a minimum KN rating of 22 KN. KN is approximately 225 pounds, and it should be labeled right on the spine of the carabiner. It'll tell you when the carabiner is closed and loaded properly, and that means along the major axis, just like this, with the spine aligned the way it's supposed to support maximum load, and it'll tell you how many KN that it'll hold. This one will hold 24 KN, but then it also shows the rating for when the gate is open, and it drops all the way down to 7 KN. So keep in mind that that means that this gate has to be working properly and closed to get the full potential out of this carabiner. When we look at actually inspecting this carabiner, we'll look for obvious damage, which would be cracks or anything like that. But when it comes to the operation of the gate, we want to move slowly, and we want to open it and close it and let it close very slowly on its own without letting it slap shut, because slapping it shut, it'll easily close on even a damaged carabiner. And you want to make sure that it's closing and it's not getting caught or staying open. If it does, you may have to add you might have to do a little cleaning with soap and water, and then you may have to add a little bit of lubrication of some kind. DMM recommends duck oil or 3-in-1 oil. I'm not sure if Petzl is still, or other manufacturers are still recommending powdered graphite, but it's something that has been used in the past. The issue that we find with powdered graphite is it's powder. So when it gets wet, it gets clumpy and it clogs up the carabiners. So, but always follow all manufacturer recommendations. When it comes, this is a second type of lock that we use when it comes to Arborist style carabiners, and this is a ball lock. So this style carabiner, you push the button and then you rotate it and then you open, and that's the two distinct motions, and it works the same, and then it locks. So the inspection isn't any different. We still want to use close it very slowly and make sure everything locks all on its own. That's the big requirement. It must be self-locking without any real struggle. So yet again, you still want to take a look at the carabiners, squeeze them when they're closed, make sure you don't see any cracks open up, inspect everything, make sure that nothing's deformed as far as bent one way or the other. And when we talk about all carabiners, they're designed to be loaded this way. They're not designed to be loaded, side-loaded, which means, for instance, let me take a look at our lanyard here. When we wrap around and clip on something, we never want to do it on the carabiner itself, like girth off a carabiner on a rope, and then we have the carabiner being loaded sideways across something and putting all of that force on there. That's not the way that this tool was designed to function properly. So by loading it, side loading it like that, you're using the carabiner in a way it wasn't designed. You're really compromising the structural ability of this to support you, and it's going to degrade the safety level of this carabiner. You don't want to repeatedly load, you don't want to ever load a carabiner like that, so just keep that in mind. That's why in this particular lanyard, for instance, the Teufelberger put a thimble on there, so if per se you wanted to, using this Hipstar lanyard, do something like that, you wrap it around the tie-in point and then you clip it on that thimble instead, and what that does is it allows you to get the same effect out of the tool while properly configuring it in a way that you're not going to compromise your safety. Okay? So we've got carabiners. There's a lot of different shapes and sizes as well. I'm not going to go too deep down the rabbit hole, but I would like to talk a little bit about this style carabiner. This is a Petzl William. I use it for a munner hitch only, for creating friction when I'm descending out of the tree to reduce friction on my friction hitch. But the way this is configured, it's not ideal for using for our life support climbing systems, because what can happen is when you have it on things like a pulley or something and you get it loaded on the nose like this, it can put too much force on that gate, and if it doesn't stay along the spine like it is right here, it can damage this and break it a significantly lower braking strength than is listed as the 27 kN that's on the carabiner itself. So just keep in mind, I personally like oval-shaped carabiners the best for my life support systems. It's a personal preference. There's other shapes like this that's slightly different, but what they all have in common is they have a tendency to have the carabiner end up right back in that neutral position, loaded along the spine of the carabiner. So that's a little bit about inspecting the carabiners. So the inspection of our life support lanyard is not dissimilar than the rope. We still want to run our hands through it. We still want to visually inspect it. And the lanyard, you can really see a little bit more wear as far as the small fibers that are starting to fray on the rope itself. It's not really a big deal, but when it gets really prevalent and it almost looks like you got a Sasquatch rope, then it might be time to retire it. It's especially with lanyards, it's a short length of rope. They're not terribly expensive, and they're one of your lifelines, so it's really important to change that regularly. When you are inspecting your gear, especially like a adjustment press-it cord like this, you want to make sure that you take it completely apart and look at each part of the hitch cord and untie it so you can look at the wear that's on the hitch cord itself. Here's the hitch cord for my climbing system. You can see that there's quite a bit of wear on there from friction rubbing on the rope. This is fairly new, so a lot of that is just dirt, but just keep that in mind. It doesn't take long to get a pretty good amount of wear on a friction hitch. And this is your part of your main life support, so make sure you inspect these regularly. Let's talk a little bit about these sonais too. Make sure that the plastic coating that's on here protecting that is intact. and covering it. It is just shrink wrap. It can be replaced with other shrink wrap, but it does protect that sewn eye on there. So you want to make sure that it stays on there, and if it comes off, probably by the time it comes off, it'll be time to retire this hitch cord anyway. But if it does come off, you might be able to put a new heat shrink on there. Another thing is, depending on the type of rope, this happens to have Technor in it. Certain hitch cords should be retired within 3 years of starting to use them, no matter what the condition. I don't think I've ever had a hitch cord that I've used regularly that lasted more than about 6 months, but that's because, like we talked about before, ultraviolet rays have a tendency to really degrade this type of synthetic fiber significantly more than your standard polyester ropes, which can deal with it a lot better. On that note, one of the things too, when we store ropes and any of our climbing gear, since ultraviolet rays are such a major factor, we want to really make sure that we have them in dark colored bags that are not getting exposed to the sun, or putting them away in a place like a metal toolbox on a truck where they're not going to be in the sun and they're not going to be exposed to light when you're not using them. Moving on, another tool that I use a lot is I use these webbing loops. Yet again, these have to be rated for at least 5,400 pounds for life support. This one is 27 kN, which is well over that, but it is labeled, so I do know exactly how much it will hold before I use it. If I were to purchase this and it did not have that label, I would not be able to use it. What you need to inspect on these is the stitching where they're connected. That's really important to make sure it's all intact and doesn't have any undue wear. And another really important thing with any of these webbing loops is to inspect every inch of it and make sure that there's no, it's not compromised in any way as far as a cut or anything like that. Any little tear on these can reduce the strength of this webbing by up to 50%. So just keep that in mind. Just a nick on it can cause quite a bit of problems on it. So that's all there is really to know about these particular loops. Actually, this one right here, I just found a small melting spot right there. So this is getting retired today. I didn't even notice that till just now. Another good suggestion when you do gear inspections, it's a good idea to trade it with somebody else. Have them look at your gear with a new set of eyes, so that maybe you're used to looking at the same damaged lanyard over and over again. It looks fine to you, but when somebody else looks at it, they're like, geez, that thing is in terrible condition. So it's really important to make sure that we inspect all our carabiners. For the purpose of time, I'm not going to go over all of them, but that's kind of a brief, quick outlook on that. Let's take a look at a rope wrench, for instance. We should inspect all of our tools that come in contact with our rope, even if they're not direct life support. This is part of a life support system, but it just increases friction. So this tether has to be life support, so it's good to inspect that and make sure it's in good working order and there's no damage. And the really important part with these is these pins are cheap and they're easy to replace. They can become worn pretty bad, and they can begin to wear away the metal on there from the friction of the rope running over and over it. So when that starts to get spots in it where it's wearing and dipping down significantly, just replace the pin. They're cheap and it runs a lot smoother with a new pin anyway. So that's our rope wrench, but really any mechanical that you might use, any portion that comes in direct contact with your life support, you're going to want to inspect. So we have things like I use a hitch climber pulley. This is one of the things that I use in my main ascent system with my rope wrench and my hitch cord. And this tool needs to be inspected as far as wiggle it, make sure it's still tight. You can't feel a lot of extra play in it. You want to look at all of the life support connections and make sure there's no undue wear in there, there's no big grooves in there. One way that we get that is when you use steel carabiners with aluminum tools. You always want to use aluminum on aluminum and steel on steel, because if you use a steel carabiner on aluminum, it'll dig a hole right in it, okay? So another thing, since we have a pulley that our rope's running through, it's important to go ahead and feel how smooth that is. Make sure there's no burrs on that pulley, because if they are, they can abrade the rope really badly. And as we know, a rope under tension cuts a lot easier than a rope just sitting there. So when you have that tension on that rope and you're running that climbing system, it's really easy to damage the rope pretty severely with a burr and a pulley, okay? As I'm going to show you guys some setups later where I'll use this rigging ring for a canopy anchor and things like that. Yet again, my rope's going to run through this tool, so I'm going to make sure it's smooth. I'm going to take a look at it, make sure it's not cracked or compromised, and I'm going to make sure there's no burrs on it that could damage any of my life support ropes, anything like that I use. So yet again, here's another rope tool. This is a Teufelberger This is the thimble saver that I like to use, and it has steel attachments here, which makes them a little safer to drop out of a tree because it's a little sturdier, but still always trying to lower tools to the ground as opposed to just bombing them out of the tree with a throw line if possible. But same system with this. I'm going to look at all the cordage. I'm going to inspect all the stitching to make sure it's in good working order. I'm going to look at all these places where the roper is going to run through and make sure it's smooth. There's no burrs in it. And I'm going to take apart this pressic that's on here, and I'm going to look at this life support cordage as well, and I'm going to make sure that it's in good shape. This is brand new, so it's in good shape. But even brand new tools, take the time to look them over and make sure there's no manufacturer flaws, because it happens, and you don't want to be the one climbing on a piece of equipment that's already damaged. So, yet again, all of these tools that we work with have to meet all the standards we talk about, including the harness. Harnesses are a lot more specific, okay? This is the Tree Motion Evo. It's a very versatile harness. I like it a lot. It has the added safety of 2 rope bridges as opposed to 1 that a lot of other harnesses only have 1. But you have to, no matter what the harness, you have to know its Achilles heel. You got to know its weak spot. And these harnesses have a tendency to wear right here on these straps that run through the lower D from up top. I always inspect these thoroughly because, yet again, this is that similar webbing type material that I inspected, that webbing loop, that if I cut this a little bit, its strength is drastically reduced. So look for those wear points where you know they're going to be, okay? So that's something that we have to keep in mind. These straps, luckily these upper straps, since they're a wear point, are only like 15 to 25 bucks. I can't remember off the top of my head to replace, so it's not a big deal. It's cheap safety compared to replacing a whole harness. Another thing that you need to look at is, all the bones of the harness. Look at all of the webbing straps everywhere, all the places where you have moving parts. The rope bridge minimally should be replaced once a year. 6 months is better because, yet again, it's a cheap piece of rope. Wherever you're going to have rope interact, wherever you're having anything interact, like your rings or anything, especially your main life support ring, to inspect that thoroughly, make sure there's no wear points or cracks. Make sure it's good, and then something that everybody has a tendency to forget about, yet again, is that everything has a lifespan, okay? So this particular harness goes into service until February of 28, okay? So make sure you know the lifespan of your tools and replace them when they need to be replaced, okay? I know they're expensive and it's an investment, but this is what your life sits in every day, so don't take it lightly. And then yet again, all harnesses should be labeled with all of the standards that they should meet for arborist work. This says Arborist saddle right on it. It has all of the certs on the underside of this tag. Right here has the European standards on it. It has the ASTM standards on it, which are what we follow here in the States. Actually, it's an international standard, and all of that should be in your Z133. So that's a brief overview of our harnesses, our ropes, and our carabiners. A little bit of inspection before we go into the tree. I'm not going to go too much deeper into it. I have other tools. Inspect every tool on your harness, but for our sake today, that should cover the bones of it, and stay safe. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we need and what we need to know before we leave the shop to get to work, okay? So number one, all of our safety standards, and today that's what we're talking about, is safety. So all of our safety standards for tree work are all going to be in the Z133. The most recent version came out in 2017. A new one should be coming out soon, but this is our reference manual. So anything I talk about today that you think I'm wrong and you look it up, maybe you're right, I don't know, look it up. So, and on top of that, there's other standards listed in here other than this particular standard to reference. So some of them are OSHA standards, some of them are other organizational body standards that we need to look up as well. So you're not just going to need this, but this is our starting point to work with, okay? So one of the things that I want to talk about a lot of before we get going is training. Training is really paramount in being safe before we leave the shop. And that doesn't just mean equipment, although that's very important. So we want to make sure that everybody's trained on every piece of equipment that they're supposed to use, either on the job, under controlled circumstances, or at the shop before we leave. But we want to make sure everybody's preferably read the manual for the big piece of equipment they use, but but more importantly, trained in person by somebody that knows how to use it properly, because a lot of people, and I think tree workers, more than a lot of other people, really need that hands-on experience to learn something properly, at least that I do. So make sure that your people are trained on the equipment, but also make sure that you're trained in emergency response, first aid, CPR, and aerial rescue, unless you're not working off the ground. But those are requirements under the ANSI standard. You need to, on a two-man crew, at least have 2 people that are trained in CPR and first aid. So that's something that you really need to make sure you have on the job site. That way if somebody gets injured, we have somebody right there ready to go. So since we mentioned that, why don't we go right into having a good, well-stocked first aid kit, okay? And let's go through what we want to have in that first aid kit. At least I personally like in my first aid kit. So a lot of this stuff is just standard first aid stuff that I got. And then some of it are things that I've picked up as suggestions by people like Dr. John Ball through other presentations that I've seen that I appreciated. So let's take a look at some of the stuff we have. Let's look at the bare bones first. I like to go with the logger's first aid kit. It's designed for an industry very similar to ours, with injuries very similar to ours. So it's going to have, large blood stopping compresses in it, things that would make sense for the type of injuries we get. Don't just go to Walgreens and get a little first aid kit for going to Disney World with your kids with some Band-Aids in it. Get something that's designed for our industry. It's got PP in it. It's got large compression bandages in it. It's got a rubber tourniquet. It's got a lot of things in here that can help, various sterile gauze, things like that are going to help in a real situation that we have. But a little bit more than that, it does have a rubber tourniquet in it, but for our purposes, with the work we do aloft and the type of injuries we get, I like to invest in a tactical tourniquet. I carry one on my harness. I think that they're very efficient, and more importantly, if I were to injure myself, I can actually tighten it up myself, and I can put it on myself when I'm in the tree, and it's got a retention clip here to put it on, so I can do it all myself with one hand if I need to. It's also large enough to go onto a larger limb like a leg, and for the type of work we do, I got to get out of this. It also has a screw on there to compress. So once you do install this, make sure you turn the screw down so it can't come undone. So once you apply a tourniquet, it should stay on until you're at the emergency room. Remember, if you do use a tourniquet, it's supposed to slow the blood, not stop it to a trickle. But this is a tool that I found I think is really important. I like it better than a blood stopper. I think it's more practical. I think if I have an injury big enough that I really need to deal with it immediately, a tourniquet is probably the only tool I'm going to need when it comes to a cut. Yet again, PP, I have extra gloves in here in case for some reason they get used or contaminated by somebody. You want to make sure you do have the little stuff in your first aid kit, like your Band-Aids and things for your day-to-day and your antiseptic. But I just want you to, think about what else you might need. I also added in a small arm sling. So if there's an arm injury on the job, I have something that's manufactured, is going to be easy to use. Somebody's going to be comfortable in it. I don't do enough first aid regularly to want to make a sling out of just cloth and material. I just bought a cheap sling and threw it in my first aid kit. In case there's more, I do have regular gauze to tie those type of things, but I would rather use something that's a little bit more comfortable. What else do I have in here? I know I have, these are SAM splints. So this is a flexible foam coated splint that you can adjust for various different broken bone injuries. The nice thing about it, let's say we have like a damaged wrist or arm, you can form it on the spot for what you need and then wrap it in gauze. It's very flexible. It's very easy to use. There's instructions on the splint itself that tell you various ways you can use it. So this, yet again, is another tool that I think is good to have in your first aid kit. And then another thing that is beyond the normal first aid kit would be a CPR mask. This protects you when you have to give somebody CPR from being contaminated by things that may come out of them. But realistically, it keeps you from getting puked in the mouth, okay? When you give people mouth to mouth, they throw up a lot, and you don't want that in your mouth, so use the mask. So that's my don't get puke in my mouth while I save your life mask. So I would recommend getting one of those. It just makes saving somebody's life so much more enjoyable. But seriously, first aid's important. Get trained, get the right tools, practice with them. Everything in your first aid kit will expire. My advice to you is when it does expire, take a day to take all that expired stuff and use it. Practice bandaging fake wounds, putting each other in slings, practice putting on tourniquets lightly, not really, And get familiar with that first aid equipment, because muscle memory is paramount when it comes to making sure you know what to do in an emergency situation. So with that comes our aerial rescue training, where we actually go out with a dummy and practice. Never practice with a real person unless you're on the ground and you want to just walk through it and talk about it, because we don't want accidents to happen where somebody actually gets hurt bringing them down. So that the first aid portion, that brings me, I also keep this webbing sling in here that doesn't really serve any immediate first aid purpose. However, since I'm talking about aerial rescue, I'll use it for bringing a climber out of the tree to support them with their harness, and I'll add that on with a carabiner to hoist them up and keep them in a neutral, comfortable position when I'm bringing them down. So I go ahead and just leave one of these webbing loops in my first aid kit, so I'm not running around looking for one if I have to rescue somebody. I know it's in my first aid kit. There's a lot more that goes into first aid in your first aid kit. That's just a brief overview on mine, okay? So, first aid kit, have one, know what's in it, know how to use it, get trained, okay? It's not just a requirement. It could save your life, it could save somebody else's, okay? Remember, when you're training somebody, you might be training somebody to save your life. You might just not be learning how to save theirs, okay? So what else do we need? We want to make sure that we have all our proper PPE. For us, safety glasses are very important, okay? They should either be stamped usually right in between the lenses or on the arm with a Z87.1. That's the spec that they have to meet in order to be used for tree work. It has to do with their shatter resistance, how much force they can take, and how much of your face that they cover when you're wearing them. So make sure you have those glasses. I'd recommend having tinted ones too to protect your eyes from ultraviolet rays. Always good to protect that as well. There's very few situations when we're out working that we don't want to have a high-vis shirt so people can see us when we're working on the road or near the road. Or more importantly, you see your ground guy walking around underneath you on the tree very easily when they're wearing a shirt like that. So these are a requirement, but they're also just a really good general idea to be seen, and they're comfortable to work in. If you buy good ones, they breathe well in the wintertime. Hard hats. Our hard hats, they must also meet a standard. We talked about them before. They only can last about 5 years in the field. Put a date in them so you know how long. Inspect them regularly. I'll go into depth with that more later. They also have a standard that they have to meet. It should be inside the hard hat. Where is this one? It's a new one. There it is. The Z89.1 is on this hard hat made by Petzl. It has the addition of a face shield, which is great when you're using a chainsaw or a chipper. It's a little added protection, and also if you can't use safety glasses because they're fogging up, it gives you a little bit more space between your face, because you can wear these down instead of safety glasses, but if you're not wearing safety glasses, it has to stay down. Helmet. Along with safety and leaving the shop and being ready, water. Especially this time of year in the summer, it is hot. Stay hydrated, drink lots of water. If you don't think you're thirsty, drink anyway. Make sure you have plenty of water in you. I can't drink enough when I'm working in the summer. Another thing that we'll use is we have these small packs of electrolytes. I don't like to drink tons of Gatorade. I'd rather drink water. These are electrolytes you can take instead of drinking a lot of Gatorade. If you don't like Gatorade, that works as well. Other sports drinks, but electrolyte tablets are a good option. They're relatively inexpensive. We also want to make sure that we have, if we're using a chainsaw, that we have proper PPE for that. So that means all the PPE I've discussed, along with suitable work boots and chainsaw protection, which means either chaps or chainsaw pants. We'll go into that more too. Work gloves. You don't have to wear gloves unless you're maintaining a chainsaw. Then I would say you have to, or you'll cut your fingers, preferably leather or Kevlar gloves. But I do like to wear gloves when I'm climbing. It has a tendency to help out with grip, less fatigue in my fingers. Hopefully it'll make me be able to last a little longer in the tree. And all in all, it's not a bad idea when you're dragging brush in general with thorns and things like that. Anything will help. When it comes down to rigging, it's pretty much so a necessity to wear a leather glove when you're running them, or you will burn right through your hands. I've had too many young guys on my crew tell me, I don't need gloves, and then the next minute, their whole hand is a blister. And it didn't need to happen if they just listened the first time. But more importantly, it didn't need to happen if I, as a manager or a boss, said, hey, put on your leather gloves, you just can't rig. Because that's what you need to do, okay? So we got our PPE, we got our water, ready to go. Some of the other things that we have to do before we leave the shop is make sure that we have all the tools for the job. We might be wrong when we leave the shop because we haven't seen the job, we've just looked at the work order, or maybe we have looked at the job, but we need to do our best to determine what we need to leave before we leave the shop. And more importantly, we want to make sure it's fueled up, it's in safe working condition, it's sharp, all of the safety features work on it, and definitely start it up and run it before you leave the shop, okay? Don't get to the job site and be like, the chipper doesn't start. Start it before you leave. When it comes down to aerial lifts, it's a requirement to fly the bucket before you use it. A friend of mine at a local tree service office told me that he actually flew the bucket one morning and the bucket failed and crashed down. So he said, wow, glad I actually followed the rules and checked the bucket, because if I had gone up in it right away, the first thing it would have done was fail. So it does happen. Things do go wrong. But if you test things out, you get things regularly serviced, and you make sure they're in good working order, it'll be okay. When it comes to your aerial lifts, make sure they're inspected annually. And when it comes to all your vehicles that are plated, so make sure that they go through the safety lane and they get their safety inspections and have an updated sticker. Other than that, we want to make sure we do a full walk around to every vehicle, as we all know, looking for any defects or damage to the vehicle that might be a safety hazard, whether it's leaky brake fluid, low air in our tires, our lights aren't working. We want to make sure all of our running lights work, our turn signals, our brake lights, everything's working before we leave the shop. And one other thing that we want to make sure is we use a lot of trailers, okay? So, like the truck behind me, we have a chipper that's attached, and we want to make sure that those safety chains are on, the pintle hitch is closed, and that the pin is in the pintle hitch. We want to make sure the plug is in for the lights on the chipper, and we want to make sure that the emergency brake cable is attached as well. So on the off chance we did something wrong and the chipper comes off the truck, those emergency brakes kick in and it stops and nobody gets hurt by it. So let's try that. That's what we really need to worry about before we leave the shop. All that, along with not just using it safe, but making sure we have the gear we need, whether that's rigging equipment, whether that's a GRCS, whether that's a specialty lift. Make sure you have it before you leave the shop.
All right, so let's get to chainsaws, the safety with chainsaws, and the PPE required while using a chainsaw. So you can see here, I have my lovely assistant, Beau Nagan, and he is wearing the proper PPE for chainsaw use. He's actually doubled it up, and you'll find out why in a second. So he's wearing a high-vis shirt, regular PPE. He has hearing protection on his helmet, which is specifically for chainsaw use. He's wearing ANSI Z87.1 rated eye protection, which is for chainsaw use. He's actually wearing Arborist chainsaw chaps, and he's wearing them in a proper way because they're snug, so if the chainsaw does happen to catch his leg, it won't shift. It'll only shift minimally. And then when it comes to boots for PPE, it's whatever your company standard happens to be. I'm still waiting for them to release chainsaw protective flip-flops so I can stay cool while I'm getting work done. And he also happens to be wearing gloves, and those in particular are Kevlar gloves, for basically the best for sharpening and maintaining a chainsaw. And that covers PPE, so thank you, Mr. Nagan. Oh, I'm actually wearing chainsaw pants. So chainsaw pants are great because you can't take them off. A lot of injuries, from what I've been told, happen at the end of the day when there's only one cut left. Guys like, I'm not going to put the chaps back on for one cut, and then boom, that's when he gets hit. Also, I can use a chipper while wearing these. Chainsaw chaps, you cannot actively load a chipper while wearing those because they're actually a grab hazard. So any brush that's going by could grab them and pull you into the chipper with them. Plus, they're super comfy. So let's get to the chainsaw. This is a Husky, or a Husqvarna 550. We're going to go over some of the safety features on this Husqvarna. Steel Husky, the features themselves might look different, but they all do the same thing. So first one is the inner throttle lock. So right here on top, hand compresses it, and now the trigger can be engaged. You have the chain catch. Where'd you go? On the bottom here. So if the chain is thrown, the chain will actually go into that before catching you. You have your on-off switch / kill switch. On the Husqvarna, by pushing down is what actually turns the saw off. And then you have the chain brake. So pulling with your thumb still wrapped is disengaging the chain, and then pushing forward, of course, will lock it. This is an emergency brake. It's not a brake. You can wear this out if you constantly are, while the chain is in full motion, just cracking it off. I'm guilty of it also. And then there's also on new saws an inertia brake, so when it drops down hard, the saw will stop. Moving on from those, well, before we move on, the four first safety features we talked about all have to be working in working condition in order for someone to use the saw. So if at any point the kill switch isn't working on a chainsaw, then the saw needs to be serviced before it can be put back in rotation to be used. Same goes for all four of those things. They need to be working. So we'll get to starting a chainsaw. So there's two ways. There's only two ways to starting a chainsaw. There's the leg cradle method, which is I basically turn my right foot to the right, catch it with my knee, and you reach down, you start from that position, and you can see that the saw is secure. The other method is the ground start method, which you can place your toe up underneath the throttle. I've also seen people put their heel right here, and you can start from that method. That's it. There's no other method. Then we could just talk about some comfortable position while using a saw. One of the biggest things I see is that people that are brand new to using chainsaws try to keep it away from them. They're scared of the toothy end. And really it's designed to sit in your core. And it's also designed to only be used right-handed. So there's no such thing as a left-handed saw. And that's because when you're using it left-handed, the stabby end, the cutty end is right on top of you. So right-handed, core position, and then this way whenever you're moving, it's always in the same spot and you're not fatiguing yourself early on. This is definitely, if you're bucking all day, you can get tired pretty quick, and just by having bad habits with how you hold it will tire you out quicker. The more tired you are, the more likely you are to hurt yourself. All right, so a couple more things. When moving with a running chainsaw, if you plan on taking more than 2 steps, the chain brake needs to be engaged. So, it's kind of like a pivot in basketball. You can have the chain brake unengaged, do a pivot, make a cut, but if you're gonna keep going, you gotta have it locked. You also cannot make any cuts above your head. So none of this, no stretching out, no Statue of Liberties, anything like that.
Now we're here at the job site, so we need to talk a little bit about having a good job briefing and a hazard briefing for the crew. In the Z133 standard, one of the requirements is to have a job briefing. Now, it doesn't have to be on paper, but to keep good record keeping and keep track and make sure everybody's on the same page, having a job briefing that everybody signs off on with everybody on the crew is really helpful and I think important to make sure everybody's staying safe and following all the protocol. So once we get on the job site, it's important before we really set up the job site, we want to go through everything that we need to do as a crew and decide the best way to do it, the most efficient way to do it. As we do that, we're going to walk through, talk about the scope of work, we're going to assign jobs, and that's going to make it better because if we assign jobs, then hopefully we won't get in each other's way. We won't have someone walking underneath the climber making cuts because he knows that those operations are going on if he needs to do something else at the same job site at the same time, okay? So as we go through, we look at the job plan, we look at the scope of work, we're going to identify the big hazards, which of course are going to be utilities as our number one, overhead utilities. We're going to look for, possibly interaction with the public or the homeowners. Sometimes you have to ask homeowners to get back in the house because they like to watch you work. But it's really important to take a look at everything that could be a hazard for you or other people. Okay? So another really important thing, as we go through the job site, we identify the work, we look at what needs to be done. When we're doing that, we're discussing the best way we're going to set up the job site for chipping, handling brush, whether or not we're going to need to rig anything, what equipment we're going to need, and we're going to, as we do that, assign all of those tasks to individual crew members. Along with all of that, based on the job, we're going to discuss an emergency response plan. So if we have a climber in the tree, that means if I'm climbing, I'm going to say, Patty, I'm going to need you to be in charge of aerial rescue in case something happens to me in the tree. And part of that includes, I want you to be responsible for calling 911. And in this particular case, we're a two-man crew, so he's the only option, okay? One of the other things that's really important is to have all of that stuff ready to go. Aerial rescue kit, first aid kit, cell phones these days, we used to bring it up, have a way to call, but pretty much so everybody's good on that. You're really more likely to mention stay off your phone when we're working so you don't get hit in the head with a stick when you're checking Facebook. So keep all of that in mind. Once we get all that set up, we've done our walkthrough, we've assigned jobs, we have our emergency response plan discussed, which includes calling 911, having aerial rescue equipment ready, you know, what is the best way in and out, making sure there's a clear path to the tree, if there's an emergency, keeping a tidy work area, all ready to go. We figured out the best way that we want to do the job. Then we're going to go back out to the front yard and we're going to set up our job site as safe as possible as far as chipper setup, cone setup, and just having everything squared away so that we're safe and have everything clear from traffic and things like that. Another thing that we want to remember is before we go out on the job, we want to make sure we have a good call and response system in place that everybody understands. And what that means is when we're working aloft and we're going to drop things out of the tree, we need to make sure that people are out of the way. So on our crew, it might be stand clear, and then I wait for my response. Clear! Stand clear, all clear cutting. Okay, so we have a call response, and then we reaffirm that we're cutting so everybody knows that that's happening now. Another thing that we do on our crew is that we all have communication systems on our hard hats. So I can talk to him at a whisper. I can say, stand clear, Patty, I'm about to cut. And he can say, oh, we're all clear. The only issue with that is when you're working and there's a possibility of other people being around, make sure that if there is, that you're saying it loud enough that people on the ground can hear, regardless if the other people on the crew can hear you. Because it's really important that everybody around you is aware that something could hit them and they might be in danger. Now that we've done our job briefing and we know what we have to do to accomplish the job, now we're in a good place where we can set up the job site in a good way that we can do it efficiently and safely. So a lot of times we're going to be using a chipper, at least a lot of tree crews do, that's how we do it here. And in some cases we're not able to put the chipper on the driveway. So this is a scenario where we couldn't put it in our simulated driveway, which is right past this pickup truck. So we're setting up on the road. So what do we need for the road? Well, first off, we got to keep in mind what goes through people's heads these days when they're driving around in the car. Number one, people are a lot more distracted because they're on their phones, so they're not paying attention to you. Number two, that means when they're not paying attention, they're not really looking at what's going on, so the more visible you are, the better off you are. So high-vis shirts aren't just a requirement, they're a really good idea. When you're working on the road, you absolutely have to have them, but there's really no reason not to just wear them all the time. It makes you more visible in the tree, on the ground. It makes it easier for everybody on the job site to see each other and stay safe. So we're working on the road. We're chipping right here behind me. Also, as you can see, we have a pickup truck parked behind the chipper. The reason that is, if we have a distracted driver, somebody not paying attention, and they do drive into our job site, they're going to hit this pickup truck instead of hitting the guy that's putting brush into the chipper. Okay, so that buffer vehicle is going to serve a really important purpose. If you don't have a buffer vehicle, another possible option is to park the chip truck facing against traffic. That way, you have the front of the truck that's going to be the buffer that if a distracted driver comes into your work site and drives into your vehicle, it's going to hit, yet again, the vehicle instead of the man driving the brush into the chipper. Okay. As you can see as well, you want to do a good job of putting out cones. Okay? If you don't have cones out designating your work zone, you don't really have a lot of excuses or complaints to have when somebody drives into your work zone or comes into a work area when they shouldn't. So your cone spacing is important. It should be approximately 1 foot for the miles per hour on the road. Here at the park, 20 miles an hour is about the fastest you can go, so we have it about 20 feet. And as you can see behind me, the cones taper off in the front of the truck. Now, behind you as well, they're going to taper off exactly the same way, and the taper should be about 100 feet when possible. Also, keep in mind that you have to leave enough room between your cones and the other side of the curb so the vehicles can pass. So you need at least 10 feet to have vehicles be able to pass safely. Okay? So we have our cones in place, we have them spaced properly, we have our chippers set up, and we should be ready to work. All right, now that we have the job site set up, we got our chipper in place, let's go a little bit more in depth with chipper safety. When it comes to dangerous tools on the job site, the chipper is probably one of the most dangerous things that we work with. So you really got to respect it, and we really want to take a little extra time to talk about some things that we think are really important. So number one with the chipper, you have to really go through all the training when it comes to the safety features on your specific chipper, understand how to properly turn it on, how to engage the clutch, how to rev it up, what order to do it in, and really make sure you understand all the safety features. The main one on most chippers that are all common are going to be the reverse bar, okay? So when you look at this, make sure that you know that when you push this back, it reverses the feed wheel, and then it starts reversing feeding the brush in case for some reason you get entangled into the brush and dragged into the chipper. So a little bit of chipper basics. Number one, for wearing gloves, we want to make sure they're not the gauntlet style gloves that go down our arms. We don't want anything extra that can get hooked on the brush and dragged into the chipper. We want our clothing to be form-fitting, not loose. That means if it's the winter time and you're wearing a sweatshirt or a jacket, make sure it's zipped up and it's not hanging open and it's not going to get caught on the brush. If you don't have high-vis shirts and you're wearing high-vis vests, make sure that they're the Velcro variety that are breakaway and will rip off you if you need to. And also, if you do have them, rip them off a couple of times and reattach them. So you want to make sure they rip off. When they're brand new, they grab pretty hard, so you want to make sure you can get them off. I had one of them get caught on me once earlier in my career, and I actually physically ripped the thing off so that it wouldn't drag me into the chipper. So just make sure you understand the limitations of that type of vest. I really prefer not wearing anything additional, so a shirt for me is ideal, okay? So let's take a look at feeding the chipper itself. You can see we have the chute, we have the feed wheels in there, we have these flaps in here, and what this says to me is don't put my hands in there, okay? We want to stay as far away from those feed wheels and getting ourselves in that chipper as possible. So anytime I'm feeding brush into the chipper, I want to make sure that I keep my hands as far away from this plane as possible, and if all possible, I try and stay on this side this far away on the chute, at the end of the chute, so I can feed in and then make sure I'm totally out of the way and not possibly getting dragged in. That being said, don't stay as far away from the front of the chute as possible, because you don't want to get entangled in the brush and dragged in. So in this particular chipper, we also have a bump stop, so this bar on the bottom will stop the feed wheels if you bump too hard in with your legs, which is a good feature. It keeps you on the side, but just keep in mind that could become a little bit of a challenge if you have brush bump the bottom of it when you're feeding it, or if you're trying to feed this with a machine. So we got our reverse wheel. If we get entangled in that, that's important. We have to keep in mind that sometimes chippers get clogged, right? So if a chipper gets clogged, this particular chipper has a large drum that does the chipping. It takes a long time for that drum to stop spinning. So what you have to do if you want to maintain this chipper, if you have to do some maintenance on the chipper in the field, is turn the chipper off and wait for that drum to completely stop rotating before you start trying to unclog a chute or get inside the feed area. You don't want to get entangled. That drum spinning, even at slow revolutions, will cause a lot of damage to you. So make sure you don't ever try and maintain a chipper when it's running, obviously, or even when any of the moving parts are still moving. So let's talk a little bit about feeding this chipper. We're set up on the side of the road. And we know that we already talked about the possibility of distracted drivers. We have a buffer vehicle in place, but a couple of added safety things that we're going to consider. Number one, just like a little kid crossing the road, we're going to look both ways before we walk out into the road to chip. Even though we have a buffer vehicle, we want to make sure somebody didn't really not pay attention and come try swerving around the vehicle and hit somebody at the chipper. So Patty here is going to chip the brush. So he's going to pick up the brush he's dragging. He's going to drag it to the chipper, and as he does that, he's going to stop before he enters the road, and he's going to look and make sure no one's coming, and then he's going to feed from the curbside so that he's protected from oncoming traffic from this direction. So this way he protects himself from the traffic flowing where it's supposed to be flowing in the area that we've designated, and he's also double checked to make sure nobody enters his work zone otherwise. So let's take a look at some ways we don't want to chip. So one thing, if we make the mistake of having two people, or if we have two people chipping at once, Patty, why don't you get in there like you're chipping on this side? And then we make the mistake of trying to go in at the same time as somebody. Go ahead and put that in. Then as this feeds in and the wheels grab it, it can grab Patty and drag him into the chipper with the brush. So whenever you're chipping, whether it's with somebody else, which yet again, one person feeding at a time, or by yourself, never feed this way, because yet again, it'll squeeze together and then you could become pinched in the brush and dragged in the chipper. Another thing that we want to take into consideration when we're using the chipper is, if you do have a heavy enough log or something you're trying to put in the chipper, just be really careful if you're loading with two men. And the reason I say that is because just like rigging, when we have, if we have two sets of hands on the rope, we don't know who's doing what. It's hard to coordinate properly. So make sure that if you are putting something heavy in the chipper, set it on the chute bed first and then step back and push it in, so we don't have any sort of one person doing something that the other person didn't expect and inadvertently having them get entangled in brush or get bumped into the chipper.